Thanks, everyone. Quite a lovely warm act I've had there. Bringing out some CISOs and security professionals who are going to join me as we look today at how ideation happens. And so normally, you oftentimes will come up here. Co-founders, founders. We'll come up here and we'll pitch you about a security topic. And what we wanted to do was look at how security professionals react to the news. And then we'll bring up founders of companies who have companies built in that space and talk about how they did ideation around that news. Because we often don't want to see companies that say, I will solve that problem that just happened. So we're going to actually start today, and we'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves as they first speak. But first we want to look at Solarwinds. I'm sure everybody's a little bit familiar with Solarwinds, but Ira, why don't you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about how Solarwinds affected your thinking.
Okay, so, it works. I'm happy. Anyway, my name's Ira Winkler. I'm Chief Security Architect at Walmart. I'm also author of few books, but most recent is Advanced Persistent Security, and You Can Stop Stupid, and the forthcoming is Security Awareness for Dummies, and that's my cheap plug. So in the meantime, like Solarwinds, everybody, Solarwinds was bad because of the implications that it could be used by hackers to really get in. And my organization at the time, not Walmart, we had Solarwinds running, and actually specifically Solarwinds Orion, which was the specific part. So first we had to overcome the hype on what is Solarwinds and are we actually using Orion or not? That was number one. Then we had to go ahead and look for signs of what actually happened, whether or not we were impacted. So we had to look for signs of intrusion and do some threat hunting there, which is frankly standard. And then, the organization we were with, we were a service provider to a lot of state, local, and government entities, and we had to go ahead and help those potential entities that were likewise hit. But, when you start looking at this, because I guess the overall scope is supply chain related, the initial thought was, okay, how many of you ever heard of Saturday Night Live? How many of you remember the church lady? Okay, a few of you. Because when Solarwinds happened, the first thing you go, because incidents happen all the time, I expect this. I don't want them to, but I expect Russia to try to break things and get foots in the door in a lot of organizations. I don't expect every organization to be 100% secure, and the only people that try to tell you they are fools or liars or a combination of both. And so when I start looking at that, I'm like, okay, that's fine. Then I started hearing, okay, then the CEO of Solarwinds came out and said, oh, well, it's an intern's fault. And then I kept thinking, isn't that special? And then I started looking, I'm like, could it be Satan? Because if you know the church lady, you'll know what I mean, and it was hysterical. If you don't, just remember, it was hysterical. However, that's when I start thinking, okay, now that has me reevaluate things because I expect software to break. I expect things to potentially happen, organizations of infrastructure type companies to potentially be hacked by APT related organizations. I, however, don't expect the CEOs of such companies to say it's an intern's fault, because when I hear somebody say it's an intern's fault, I start thinking, what idiot allowed that intern to have unfettered access to their software to allow for the breach? And that's my real problem with the Solarwinds supply chain aspect.
Well, that's a great question to bring up Yoni Shohet, who's the CEO of Valence Security, because sometimes the question isn't what intern altered our software, but what intern bought that third party. I know Sounil over there is a huge fan of S-bombs. We sometimes don't always agree with them. But one of the most important things, I think, is knowing who your vendors are so that you even know potentially what software and what challenges they have. So Yoni, welcome.
Thank you. So
you built a company around this time. Like, how did your thinking around ideation be affected by Solarwinds and the concept of, I think you got the business application mesh, all these SaaS services you use?
Yeah, so at the time I was really looking through my ideation process at SaaS applications, authorization, authentication, and how we can help the industry improve their controls around these areas. And when we look at Solarwinds as the campaign itself, not precisely what happened to Solarwinds as a company, we see a lot of different techniques that were used as part of supply chain access, and the fact that today attackers understand they need to target the weakest link within your security posture, and they'll find a vendor within that has access to your organization, and through there they'll find the right path into the sensitive data or into the privileges that they're looking for within the company. And as such, we started to look and talk to a lot of industry experts to understand what are you doing today about third-party risk, about supply chain access, and about kind of how you today control what access do external vendors have into your organization. And we kind of opened up Pandora box into a lot of different methods today when you look at the decentralization of IT and the fact that you have so many people today that can onboard new services, new vendors, provide them access, provide them high privilege access. And we realized that there's really like a mesh in the cloud between different business applications, whether if it's through a no-code, low-code automation, third-party apps, and API tokens that today are kind of wandering around without kind of governance and control within the company to help them secure and govern these types of access by third-party vendors.
So it sounds like you saw SolarWinds, had some ideas as a result of it, and then went and tested them and learned some things that weren't really on your radar at first.
Yeah, I think that we spoke about it last week. I think that we say in Hebrew that it's like mushrooms after the rain, but once you have a large major breach, you see a lot of startups coming up and trying to solve. I try to solve SolarWinds and I try to solve SolarWinds. So I don't think we kind of put that as our front. We want to solve the SolarWinds problem because it's not a problem. It's more of a symptom of a chain of supply chain attacks, and how we can really talk to the industry and talk to the customers and the kind of the practitioners to better understand how we can help better manage the risk that is associated with supply chain and not specifically solve a problem, because there's basically there's a trust problem, because you do an assessment, you onboard a vendor, and then you need to trust that vendor with a lot of activities they can perform within your organization. And we really want to help these companies trust them more by helping them manage the risk that is associated with the day-to-day business.
So a quick question for the security folks on this side, which is I think SolarWinds and most recently Log4j are both sort of these incidents where the supply chain was compromised with companies and products we'd never heard of before. Like most CISOs have never heard of Log4j before December of this year. But I think there's a telling thing here, which is you weren't worried about SolarWinds specifically, but were you worried about the other companies like them? And so is this an approach that at least resonates to not solve just one incident?
So, I mean, you always look at that. So, for example, with SolarWinds, my first reaction was mitigating controls. Let's look at Log4j right now. There are good organizations out there that will have vulnerable Log4j in them for months to come. Not because they're bad at what they do, but because there's just so much to take care of regarding this. Because Log4j, you can't just update it without making sure that it doesn't bring the organization down. You have to do regression testing on it and things like that, and that's critical. And even knowing what regression testing needs to be done. And when I look at Log4j, the first thing that goes into my mind was, how do I not how do I secure tens of millions of systems potentially really quickly, but what mitigating controls can I put in place really quickly to try to stop the impact before I can start patching? And then looking at the supply chain along the way and figuring out, it's helpful to understand the supply chain, because I have to know what can I patch first, where it needs to be patched, what is easy to patch, and then start figuring out from there after implementing the mitigating controls.
I think part of the challenge that we had as CISOs with Log4j, many CISOs saw Log4j as a problem to be solved. And when that happened, we put in a number of mitigating controls, as Ariel mentioned. I tried to look at Log4j and SolarWinds and all the other supply chain issues as I have as a predicament that I have to manage. And it means I can't solve that problem. It's not a problem to be solved as much as it's a predicament that I have to manage. There's a serenity prayer. Give me the courage, or give me the courage to be able to accept the things that I cannot change. Give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think it's important for us to know the difference between those things that I can fix, not Log4j, not Solarwinds, and those things which I have to accept, which is supply chain, and to be able to know that that's my responsibility to accept that and manage the risks associated with it. That's the difference in, I think, how we should approach things.
Okay, yeah, I like that, and we're going to have to move to our next panelist, but I think, Yoni, one thing you can take away from that is you should add to that prayer and the knowledge to know what all of the things are, because that's often what's missing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're step to another incident. So Volkswagen. So Sounil, I want you to talk a little bit about Volkswagen. And for those not familiar with it, this was a breach of 3.3 million user records.
Yeah, so if I recall, it was a breach of a number of records, but it was because of a third party. Again, another situation of a supply chain issue. And if I recall correctly, it's a similar issue that we've all dealt with, which is we have data that we want to protect, and I think in this case it was marketing data with customers, email addresses, whatnot, and it proliferated. It proliferated into places that we didn't expect it to proliferate to. The perspective I would have with this particular instance is to understand, to have controls around the proliferation of information, especially when that proliferation is automated.
Right.
Okay, so if I have automated mechanisms for copying data, for moving data, for whatever else it is, I would also like to have automated mechanisms for governing those decisions around what kind of data is it and where is it allowed to go. And unfortunately, we don't really have the tools for doing that. And unfortunately, companies like Volkswagen suffered consequences of that.
I think that's perfect now to start talking about some ideation with Liat Hayun, who's the CEO of Eureka Security. So Liat, welcome. So Liat, I think you looked a lot at cloud data stores as you were thinking about how to found a company. And I think there were a lot of different things you could have done. How did you decide where to focus on and what problems were worth solving?
So I think the short answer is talking to folks like these ones on the stage here. And what we realized through the process is that when you think about migrating to the cloud, you think about it as kind of a single instance. There's a project, you migrate to the cloud, and you're done. But as a matter of fact, as we talk to more organizations, what we identified is that it has usually 3 phases. So many organizations started migrating with SaaS applications, their Salesforce, their emails, and so on. The second thing that many organizations have migrated is their infrastructure, their compute instances, their own applications. And then most recently, what we're now seeing being migrated with the levels of sensitivity that are associated with that is data being moved into the cloud. So that's kind of one trend to be aware of. The second thing is that as organizations were thinking about how to migrate data into the cloud, they took a pretty naive approach as to thinking, you have these 10 databases in these 2 infrastructure locations, and you'll just move them into the cloud as they are, right? And that would have made sense, but once you have data in the cloud, there's sort of an amplification process. You have data in the cloud, it's easier to store more data in the cloud, you don't have to have anyone run over and install new hardware. You then have more use cases that data could be used for. Marketing, product analytics, data science. It's not something that back then only a few organizations have data science and machine learning. Now almost every organization has it. And that triggered many more use cases around which teams and which technologies this data needs to be stored in. So you have this amplification mechanism where many organizations transferring into the cloud with their data 3 years ago with 10 data stores find themselves now with 100 or 200 data centers, databases in the cloud. And that leads to the problem that Sounil talked about, which is the processes, the manual processes and audits and capabilities that teams took to protect that data in the cloud just don't scale well. It doesn't work. If you monitor 20 databases on a monthly basis, that's fine. But if you're trying to do that for 2,000 databases, that doesn't work anymore.
And I suspect finding the databases is equally a challenge. It used to be that if I wanted to replicate a database, I had to put in some large purchase orders, wait for hardware, and then have some migration process. And now I'm just in the cloud and I click a button and I have a copy of my database.
Exactly. So what you're actually talking about are two problems. So the first one, as organizations shifted into the cloud, some of them have felt, this pressure, whether if it's from an organizational perspective or just wanting to move ahead, they kind of lifted and shifted their databases into the cloud. With that approach, they lost track of where their data is. You now have a MySQL database on an EC2 or a compute instance that you're not really tracking and you're not really monitoring that same way. And then even once data is already in the cloud and monitored in a good way, you still have that data being moved and transferred and shifted into different locations, different data stores, different technologies to be used by those different teams for many different use cases.
I feel slightly called out because I do, in fact, have a MySQL database in EC2 that I'm not looking at very well. So when you hear this approach, right, does this resonate that this is a problem that companies are increasingly facing and are going to face more in the future? Because oftentimes we see people trying to solve like the 5-year-old problem that just got highlighted, and here this is a much more forward-looking of we're on this cusp of a transformation.
Yeah, I think, so one of the nice things is we've faced this challenge. I'm not calling it a problem yet, but we faced this challenge.
Predicament.
We've been in a predicament, and over time, we figure out best practices for how we manage risks in that predicament. Eventually, it goes from things that are really complex to things that are complicated. And I think we're at the stage where it's complicated, and this is where we need technologies to help it go from, and complicated means that we know what we need to do, it just requires 100 steps to do it. And as a result, a lot of us fail in following those steps very, methodically. And this is where technology is super helpful for you. When technology can help us walk through those 100 steps and do it repeatedly, that's when we can start moving things from complex to complicated. And eventually, we want to get to a point where it's all baked in and that becomes really simple. We're not quite there yet, but I think the kind of innovation that we're seeing is helping us move to that stage where it's easier because it's baked into the technology or it's being done by the technology for us.
Thank you. And one quick question before we're done here, which is, people often only see the success of ideation, right? You came out, there's this company, you have an idea. How many ideas did you discard or put on the back burner along the way?
I can't even count. It depends on how you ask. But I can give one example for something. As we were looking about the data protection space, even as we were focused on that space specifically, there was this question of what is more concerning, protecting the data you have or identifying data that you don't have. And of course, it's not this over that. But what we realized is even the locations you know about, even the cloud accounts you manage, already pose a pretty significant problem for many organizations, as opposed to some, one data store and one account used by a specific user in their organization. So having to choose and balance between those two types of problem, making sure that you're focusing on the use cases that are truly keeping your customers up at night as opposed to the ones that are nice to have, is really critical for this stage in the company.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Liat.
My pleasure.
Okay, now we're going to move on and talk a little about Capital One. Like, you can't have a security breach conversation without Capital One. So, Anthony, you were sort of up front on Capital One. And how did that make, how did you respond and react to the incidents there?
So, a little bit of background. So, Anthony Johnson, Delverisk. Actually, awesome to actually be sitting next to two other authors as well. I will talk about the high level of Capital One as I was the deputy CISO there before the breach. Capital One is, I think, a great example of organizational drift and misconfiguration of not fully controlling the entire environment. When you look at what kind of transpired and happened there, it wasn't an overly complicated, oh my goodness, you had to be a super crazy smart threat actor. This was more of a, how did this happen? Was this an intern conversation type of thing? The best analogy that I like to use is, I know a company, they paint the Brooklyn Bridge. They start on one end, they spend a year painting it, and then they go right back to the beginning of the Brooklyn Bridge. Because by the time they are done, and this is the same thing for enterprise rollout maturity, there's so much drift that happened in the beginning, you have to repave it again, repaint it again. And organizations in situations like Capital One are very similar, so consistency and understanding that control plane and reinforcing it is super important.
I really do like that analogy. And while Ariel Shiftan, who's the CTO of Piiano comes up, I want to extend that one a little bit. Imagine if the bridge got longer every year.
Yes.
But you only still spent 1 year painting. At some point, the bridge is too long, but you keep going back to the start and you stop painting the edge of the bridge.
Exactly.
So Ariel, you were doing ideation, Capital One happens, and you're looking at building a company. So how does this affect your ideation process, and what ideas did you like, what did you not like, and where did you end up?
Yeah, so we were looking on Capital One and many other data breaches out there, and as internet civilians ourselves, we realized something has to be changed. Okay, we don't want to keep hearing about those breaches. We don't want our families to be affected by those, right? And on top of all of this, there is so many security products out there, and everybody are trying to use them, but still, it continues, right? So we realized something has to be changed dramatically. Something has to be done differently, and eventually what matters is the data. What matters in our perspective when looking on data privacy and when looking on the trying to protect all our personal information is we need to look on that perspective, and that data should be kept in a much better way. And we looked back and tried to find similar things that happened in the past, and we saw, for example, credit card numbers that used to be just stored plain text, and everybody kept it that way, and eventually these were leaked. And as a result, the PCI came out, and everybody tokenized them today and put them in a vault. And similarly, with machine-to-machine secrets, a couple of years ago, everybody used to keep them just in the source code or maybe configuration files, but they got out of control. So HashiCorp and other companies came with their vaults, and they realized, hey, something has to be built to get the control back to the organizations. And we thought that PII and personal information is a similar, very sensitive piece of information that has to be kind of taken separately and with special mechanisms. And after talking with many organizations, we saw really some of them that starting to build such an internal data vault that is the solution for such very sensitive personal information, as you can no longer rely on protecting your perimeter. We all understand that with the complexity of the systems and the complexity of the security products, nobody can really say, hey, all these bad guys are outside of my perimeter. You have to assume they are inside your own company, and then you need to focus on the data, prioritizing it, and protecting that information.
What I like about that approach is how you said, this problem that we're facing looks like problems we've already solved, and are those solutions portable that I can, do a similar solution? And so, Anthony, I really want to hear, is that when you talk to companies or try to solve problems, how often do you look at the past and say, can I just solve this in a similar strategy as to what's already solved?
Yeah, I think it's a critically important piece. One of the ways I look at most companies is I call them BC and then DE, so before cloud and then developer enabled. And it's kind of like this demark of, was that business fundamentally driven 80% before cloud? Because they have a different thesis and a different approach and legacy. And if they're developer enabled, they started in 2012, they have a completely different approach of how they approach security. So the history is really, really important. It's important to their go forward, and it's also important to understand some companies are going to say, we're just willing to accept that. We'll buy some insurance and hope and pray that nothing really happens.
That's really expensive now.
It is.
So when you hear that shift between the developer focus and I don't even know what we would call the before cloud focus,
I was calling it BC and then DE.
I like it to BC. It's like, but you're developer enabled and you're just something else. We're not sure what the something else is. As you're looking at your market, how do you decide between which of those? I mean, obviously, developer-enabled is where everybody's going, but how do you think about who's going to get there that isn't there yet?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So there's companies that aren't yet developer-enabled, who are probably in your target market as you're doing ideation, and there's companies that are. Like, you could build just for cloud-native companies, you could build for companies who have legacy on-premise. How do you decide between those two markets and maybe how to help people move from one to another?
Yeah, right. So first, we understand that eventually the trend is everybody going to the cloud. So we want to focus on the future. We prefer not to focus on the old stuff or legacy stuff. We want to bring new companies the ability to bring everything the right way. We believe centralizing personal information and vaulting it, as I partially discussed earlier, is the right way for the long term. Because today companies keep wrapping existing stores or augment them with more and more security layers, but it's not solving the problem. Everybody see it on the media, right? We all see it there. So the right way to work for the long term is building it with privacy by design, by separating personal information, keeping it in a place that it's secure enough, and still provides you all the business workflows you need to do with it. So thinking about, hey, we want to focus on how stuff are built the right way, obviously targeting to the cloud, targeting developers, by the way, is the right way. Most security products today, they try kind of to avoid talking to developers, okay? They're trying to be, hey, let's integrate it with DevOps, maybe just security people. And we have the experience of doing security in scale in Magic Leap. Me and my partner, we led product security in Magic Leap, and we realized that you cannot just do security by the end of the development. We all call it today shifting left security, and we actually did it in the past. And then when privacy came to the picture, right, on the last couple of weeks, everybody are much more aware to privacy, okay? It's not just for no reason that Mark Zuckerberg is being invited to the Senate to talk about privacy. Everybody today care more and more about privacy. And the way to solve it from the roots, the way we see it, is by providing the developers the right tools, the right infrastructure to build it in as part of the development, not post-development.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate hearing your thoughts on that one. Appreciate y'all coming up and letting people see how you reacted to these incidents. We're a little short on time because that previous speaker ran a little bit long. Thought he was very important, but so thank the audience. You guys have been wonderful. Y'all have been wonderful, and we hope you have a lovely day.